Hi, everybody. Today's Thursday, January 8th, 2026, and our dear friend, our brother Alex Krainer is here with us. Welcome back, Alex.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Always good to join you, and warm greetings to all our audience. This is not our first one today this year, is it?
Yeah,
Okay, so I think I already said Happy New Year, so I don't want to repeat it. Maybe
yeah. It's
you
Happy
know,
New Year, exactly. Yeah.
double double positive could make a negative.
Alex, let me start with the announcement of the Chinese government. The official representative of Chinese Foreign Ministry, Mao Ning, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, she says the seizure of a Russian oil tanker in the Atlantic was a gross violation of international law by the United States. She always added the new sanctions that they're preparing to impose on Russia, and they're all illegal, and nobody, at least China, would not care about them. What are we heading? Where are we heading, in your opinion, when it comes to the latest news in Venezuela? The somehow kidnapping of the Venezuelan president and the aftermath, events. Somehow, this sort of new confrontation between the United States and on one side and Russia on the other side.
I I have to say, Nima, I don't know where we're going because I don't know what Trump is doing. There's a number of theories, and since the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, I listened to many hours of podcasts and read many articles to try to work it out. And I've paid especially attention to what the let's call it the pro globalist uh, opinion leaders are talking. So we're talking about people like uh, John Bolton and Rory Stewart, and Rory Stewart is a former UK MP and part of the whole foreign policy establishment since many years. Um, People who were close to Blair, eh, they don't know, right? They're guessing. They know one thing: they hate Trump, but they don't know what Trump is doing. So whatever it is that Trump is doing could be different than what everybody's talking about, So it's going to have something to do with oil, because oil is obviously going to be the great attractor that's going to incentivize a lot of people in powerful positions in the United States, because they want that oil, and that's I'm talking about powerful people on Wall Street. Um, but then there's this whole deal with voter irregularities, with the Dominion voting system and Smartmatic machines, Smartmatic software, that somehow has something to do with Venezuela. Apparently, some of those servers were run from out of Venezuela, or some people say that it was the the software was created in Venezuela, which I don't know if that's true. But there were other countries that were highlighted for their role in that, namely Serbia. So, already back in 2020, we heard about Venezuela and Serbia having some kind of a role in uh, election rigging, not just in the United States, but in general. But then, when the affair broke in the aftermath of the 2020 elections, then it turned out that it's a larger international network. And then when there were a great number of testimonials and witness statements and affidavits about these voting irregularities, then the Dominion Systems executives suddenly vanished. The U.S. executives, and they moved their offices, some of it to Canada over the border. And so they had a regional headquarters, I think, in Toronto, And one of the people who was involved was Lord Malloch Brown, who is a very close associate of George Soros. But beyond there being a few Venezuelan people involved, and apparently some of them were government ministers, and one Venezuelan businessman who was apparently the controlling shareholder of the Smartmatic software company. The trace of ownership gets lost in the network of offshore centers, uh, many of which are in Caribbean. Since the 1960s, the United Kingdom, Britain, created 14 offshore financial centers that are completely unregulated. There's no, they operate. They operate outside of the reach of international law for anybody who's attached to that concept, and they're completely untransparent, unregulated, in private hands, and so the trace gets lost there. How exactly Venezuela got enmeshed in all that, I don't know. But when a country is under very rigid sanction, it becomes very porous in the sense that like Syria was put under Caesar sanctions, and then nothing works in the country. People have no money. People have no future. And then I guess Western intelligence agencies can penetrate easily with and get a whole lot of things done with bribes. And so it may be that Nicolas Maduro knows a little something about this. And then there's also the drug running angle, which, we know that there's no drugs of any appreciable quantities coming into the United States from Venezuela, and no fentanyl is going to the United States from Venezuela. But the whole money laundering network that enables this drug trafficking, which also involves human trafficking, because some of these same cartels that run the drug networks have also facilitated the logistics and border crossings for millions of illegal aliens going into the United States. And we know that about 8 million Venezuelans left the country over the last 10, 20 years, and presumably many of those ended up in the United States. So again, I don't have the answer for why Trump wanted Maduro abducted, but let's say, there is a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that it may be related to the voting machines and election rigging business, and the trafficking in, what do you call it, drugs, humans, and weapons into the United States, and then laundering the money out of the United States. But there it seems that Canada is playing a major role. And I just yesterday published an article titled, "Is Venezuela's Fate a Warning to Canada?" Which may sound surprising, what does one have to do with the other? But I didn't invent that. That was actually the title of the Globe and Mail's editorial on Sunday. So, 5 days ago? The title was literally, "Is Venezuela's Fate a Warning to Canada?" And then you think, well, is it paranoid schizophrenia to think that abduction of Nicolas Maduro has something to do with Canada? And as it turns out, not so much. There is a real link, and Canada is up to their eyeballs in dirty business. Right on the border of the United States, there are multiple super labs in Canada from which things like fentanyl, methamphetamines, fake Xanax, all kinds of illegal drugs were being laundered, smuggled into the United States. The headquarters of this operation seems to be Toronto. The but also British Columbia. And most of the money that was laundered back into the from the United States, because these all these sales are in cash, right? They were most of that money was being laundered back into Canada, and there has been a okay. So I can't lay all this out because it's very extensive, but back in March, an online publication called The Bureau published a very extensive interview with one David Asher, right? David Asher is a former senior U.S. State Department official who has close ties to the Trump administration's financial and national security apparatus. And they've been trying very, very hard to break these drug smuggling networks in Canada. And they busted one super lab, which is like they said, this is the largest, most sophisticated fentanyl synthesizing lab that they ever busted. And it was in Canada, in British Columbia, close to the United States. And then the money from sales of this fentanyl was being laundered back into Canada, principally through the TD Bank. You know, a lot of people will have maybe brokerage accounts with the TD brokerage. That's the organization. And apparently, this is the largest money laundering operation in history of the United States. And in 2022, there was a certain thing called a Cullen Commission, Cullen, who published an extensive report about this. So 2022, right? So almost 4 years ago. Between then and now, the Canadian government has done nothing. Nobody went to jail. They didn't dismantle the money laundering organization or the drug running networks. So this is why the Canadians are feeling very, very nervous about this, because the Trump administration is trying to put all of these organizations, so drug running, people smuggling, how do you call it, money laundering of the drug money, under an anti-terror legislation, because through normal legal proceedings under international law, the American investigators have been completely unable to trace these networks, because Canada has something in their legal system which supposedly to protect human rights and assure fairness. Every time the American investigators target a suspect, after 90 days, the Canadian authorities have to inform these people, oh, look, by the way, you're being targeted. And there's no way to mount a proper undercover sting operation in that much time. So every time they go after somebody, they find their suspect, people disappear because they find out that they're being targeted. So they move, they change their phone numbers, they change their security operation procedures. And so every time they slip out of the hands, and Canadians have been not only unwilling to assist the Americans with these investigations, it seems that they were positively protecting them. They've created like a crime permissive legal environment. Okay, so that's Canada. But then there's also we have to remember, in the Caribbean, there's 14 offshore banking centers that have also been virtually all of them involved in in money laundering operations. And again, through the normal mechanisms of international law, they are untouchable because they actually have complete legal immunity. And so it seems to me that what Trump is doing is what Trump may be doing is attacking this operation, which is absolutely massive. There's between 50 and 75 trillion dollars in these offshore centers. Okay, it's absolutely colossal. And then there's another dimension to this, and I have to mention it because it could prove relevant, and that is that the Russians have had this system in their crosshairs for a long time. And I don't know if your viewers follow the Promethean Action Network, but they produce very good reports on YouTube and on X. And one of the women who is active there, Susan Kokinda, she pointed out that in 2014, the one of the Russian one of well no the head of the Russian anti anti-drug enforcement official. His name was Viktor Ivanov. Well, probably still is Viktor Ivanov. He gave a speech at a conference called Alternative Development for Drug Producing Regions. And so he said, this is the foundation of the Western financial systems. It it couldn't it couldn't survive without this massive drug running network. So Trump goes to war in the Caribbean. Marco Rubio said this is the war on drug trafficking networks and oligarchs. Um, and then, we have this seeming incident between the Russians and the Americans in the Caribbean Sea over an empty tanker. And now we have Russian naval vessels and a Belgorod class submarine also going to the Caribbean. Nima, I have no idea what the plan is, if there is a plan. Trump's actions seem so thuggish and gangster style, mafia style actions, that it's generated a lot of indignation and outrage from a lot of people. But I think we need to consider certain plausible explanations that are not being discussed, but that could be at the heart of what the Trump administration is doing. And so I think we'll know with time. I think we'll only know with time. Oil obviously has something to do with it. As I said, it's going to be a great attractor for the bankers and the oil companies. But like if you're going into a dirty war, you're going to have to bring some allies along with you. And then the abduction of Nicolas Maduro. I have to say this: to me, the whole affair seems so incredibly strange and unlikely that I kind of suspect that it was arranged not between Darcy Rodriguez, the current president, and Nicolas Maduro's handpicked vice president, nor between anybody else. It may have been agreed with the government of Venezuela, led by Nicolas Maduro. That Nicolas Maduro simply wasn't given a choice. He had to turn himself in, and that he went voluntarily. And I know that there are reports about killed Cuban security people and some injured, but I think that this is all garnishing the story, because if you had no killed anybody on the ground in Venezuela, then that would put Darcy Rodriguez as a suspect number one for giving up Nicolas Maduro. If there was an actual gunfight and people died and then the Americans took him by force, well then, she's in the clear. I don't think she gave him up. I really think that this was a deal between Maduro and Donald Trump, because also, look at what happens. Maduro comes to the United States. Does he look like somebody who just got downgraded from president of Venezuela to a prisoner? He doesn't. He's smiling. He's hugging with the DEA officials. He's wishing them Happy New Year. He's showing thumbs up, victory signs. A friend of mine, Ian Burlingame, who was in the special forces and in military intelligence, he said no, 100% he went into witness protection program because he's got important evidence to share, important testimonials. He knows where the bodies are buried, and he probably wouldn't live long if he was left free as a president of Venezuela. We have to also look at things that didn't happen rather than things that did happen. Very often, when the Americans go to decapitate a nation's leadership, they kill. You know, they killed Muammar Gaddafi. They didn't bring him to trial alive. They wanted to kill Bashar al-Assad if it wasn't for the Russians extricating him. Um, they We know that there was a kill order against President Viktor Yanukovych when the coup in 2014 happened. Again, the Russians extricated him. We know that they wanted to kill uh, uh, Erdogan in Turkey, and so on and so on. Here he was taken alive without a glitch, together with his wife. Okay, it doesn't look good, but it could be, plausibly part of the agreement where he said, like, okay, I'll go, but I want my wife to go with me as well. And it's like, okay. And then another thing that didn't happen is there was no regime change. So people will say, like, oh, yeah, there was a regime change. No, there wasn't, because other than Nicolas Maduro being removed, the Maduro regime remained in power completely. Nothing else changed. No legal changes, no government changes, and so forth. So the whole affair very clearly is inexplicable. And as I said, these globalist observers, like John Bolton and a whole lot of these British analysts and commentators and public officials, they have no idea what happened. They really do not have an explanation. And I must have watched like 10 hours of podcast with various American and British globalist people. Anthony Scaramucci, uh, the guy who was Bill Clinton's campaign manager. I forget his name now. It escapes me. Many of them, and they're all at a loss. So anyway, it would be silly to pretend that I know what it's about. Since you're sitting in Iran, I'll say one thing that I think it's not about. I don't think it's about Iran, because a lot of people are saying, this is a long answer, I'll wrap up quickly. A lot of people are saying, oh yeah, they went into Venezuela because they want to secure the oil before they attack Iran, because Iran is going to close the gates, the gates of Hormuz and all this. That doesn't make any sense at all, because Venezuela's oil production is less than 1 million barrels a day. It's 20% of what it used to be at peak. To ramp up Venezuelan production to 3, 4, or 5 million barrels a day, it would take at least 5 years and many billions of dollars of investment. Not only that, Venezuela has a potential insurgency of up to 3 million people, in addition to their regular military units. These people are Chavistas to the core. They're fired up, they're indignant, they will not just roll over. So you can't go into a country and start investing 10, $20 billion for oil extraction if you're constantly going to be under attack and under an insurgency. So you'd have to be stupid to think that you're just going to waltz into Venezuela and take their oil because you're anticipating closure of the gates of Hormuz. That doesn't make sense. I mean, it's unrealistic. So I don't think that the calculation is, okay, we're going to take Maduro and then we're going to attack Iran. Some people are also saying, like, well, there's all these C-17 cargo planes from the United States that are going to Europe and the United Kingdom, bringing all these troops, special troops and weapons. Yeah, okay, apparently that's true. But, Trump also wants to take Greenland. The UK is a bit closer to Greenland than it is to Iran. If they were going after Iran, then maybe they'd be bringing these troops and these weapons to Diego Garcia and to Qatar and so forth. But that's not. I don't. It seems too recklessly risky to do that. And I also suspect that the whole spat about Trump trying to kill Vladimir Putin is also, it doesn't make sense to me. If for no other reason, is because if you ask yourself why would he do that? What would he possibly gain by assassinating Vladimir Putin? There's no answer to that question. That's just crazy. It would just be an evil act for the sake of being bad, because there's nothing to gain. It's not like if you take Vladimir Putin off of the scene, that Russia falls into your hands like a ripe piece of fruit. Russia is a very robust nation. There's Patrushev, there's Medvedev, there's all kinds of people there who would take Vladimir Putin's place. So to wrap up the whole thing, I would say that we don't know what's happening because nobody seems to know. But I suspect that in addition to Trump team, a very narrow Trump team knowing what they're doing, I think that the Russians and the Chinese also know what Trump is doing.
Yeah. Alex, I think we can find some sort of clue in the national security strategy of the Trump administration. In the national security, they're basically talking about the focus on the Western Hemisphere, you know. And in that strategy, you understand if they go, because they want to, to convince all of these governments in Latin America, in the northern, Canada, Mexico, coming down to Brazil, Colombia, that the king is the United States. You have to understand that. And so, what could be, the solution for that? You go in Venezuela, you intimidate, show some sort of force, because coming out of Venezuela, Donald Trump said something amazing to me that I have no reason to understand that. I have no clue to understand what he's talking about. He said, "What? Look at what we've done in Venezuela, and look at what Russia is doing in Ukraine." It's not even comparable in my mind because the nature of two conflict is not a conflict between the United States and Venezuela. Is there is no war between the United States and Venezuela, and Russia is fighting a war of attrition against the whole NATO, the whole West. Compares the situation in Ukraine to what has happened in Venezuela. It's so much childish. It's so much, superficial when you look at the comments on the part of Donald Trump. That's why I think many of us are confused about what's going on with the Trump administration.
Nima, I've stopped listening to what Trump says because it seems to me that a lot of Trump's statements are calculated to generate emotional outrage, and I'm not immune to it. I was when I heard the news about Venezuela, I was traveling, but obviously you get news everywhere. I was profoundly disappointed. I thought this is a complete betrayal of everything that we thought he stood for. But then, Trump does do this on purpose because it sets everybody's hair on fire and everybody's, emotionally focused on something while he's doing something else completely. And I've noticed that a lot of people have gone with this outburst of indignation, and then they're calling Trump names, and they're condemning him in every possible way, like a madman, a maniac, orange-faced baboon, like all kinds of things that I've heard. But when you're doing that, you're not thinking and you're not analyzing what's really going on. I try to ignore Trump's antics, and I try to understand what is it that they might be doing, because there's a possibility that Trump is a madman. Okay, that's a possibility. There's a possibility that somehow somebody got to him and that he's doing the bidding of these globalists around the world. Wall Street and the City of London, basically. And then there's a possibility that he is delivering as promised, but in ways that we cannot understand and keep track of. Uh, I don't think that he's crazy, and I think I've observed certain episodes in the year of Trump's administration that show very clearly that his administration know what they're doing. At least when it comes to the Balkans, and when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And I think that they've played a very, very constructive role in both those cases. Um, what he's doing in Venezuela, I cannot say, but it seems to me that these statements that he's okay. So first of all, we have to understand Trump was formed in part by his career in as a game show host and in World Wrestling Federation, and that maybe that formed him in the sense that when you score some kind of a success, you make the maximum out of it because you want to impress
That's the
everybody.
point. That's the
Yeah,
point. Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
You want to impress everybody, and you want to scare your adversaries into not defending themselves, into putting their arms down and saying, "Yes, sir, we will do as you say." Now, abduction of Nicolas Maduro. A lot of people are making like, "Oh, what a precision surgical, perfect operation! What genius! What phenomenal!" Yeah, unless it was as an agreed deal, because like you went there with four helicopters. I think it was four helicopters. Maybe it was more or less, but and first you said nobody got hurt, and you got not only the president but also his wife. With like getting one person uninjured is complicated enough, let alone two. And you dropped like 500-pound bombs, and the security system didn't wake up. I find it very unlikely. So I would say most probably that was a deal. And then if we rewind the clock a few weeks back, I don't know, like 2 or 3 weeks back in December, we had statements from Trump. He said, "We're very close to a deal." He didn't explain what kind of a deal, but he said, "We're very close to a deal. We're talking to the Venezuelans," and so forth. And then you had statements from Nicolas Maduro himself, who was talking about he's had conversations with Donald Trump himself. And Maduro was saying, no, no, they were very cordial and respectful. Well, you know, they were talking about some kind of a deal. Maybe this was the deal that they were talking about. I don't know. Nima, not any better than anybody else, but I think we have to try to take as much context into trying to discern what's going on. And 100%, the biggest enemy of humanity, headquartered in the city of London, is this massive network of money laundering, supranational, um, global institutions that enjoy absolute legal immunity and are untouchable to any nation's law enforcement. And so when people say that Trump is wrecking the system of international law, you have to kind of get rigorous about studying what international law is and isn't. It's not just, oh, we're not going to be attacking each other. Is that there are 76 documented international organizations, including banks, including uh, Gavi, vaccine thing, World Health Organization, um, the the International Energy, all of these which enjoy complete immunity, meaning their premises are inviolable, their archives are inviolable. You can't even go into their offices to conduct an investigation. And if you got any of their documents, they're not permissible in court because you obtained them illegally, because legally you just simply cannot. So they enjoy complete legal immunity and they're allowed to do whatever they like. So um, it seems to me that Trump has gone rogue because he's targeting exactly this enemy. And then, if we go back 12 years to 2014 and we have Viktor Ivanov talking about the very same enemy and saying, this is the enemy of humanity, this is where it's at, maybe this is the target. But we'll find out.
Alex, I really believe that what Donald Trump is doing is creating some sort of backlash. For example, in Brazil, that I follow closely, I know the society, I live there. And the problem is that the American mindset is totally different from what we have in Latin America. In Latin America, they don't call it soccer, they call it football. You have to understand that these sort of games that in the United States are so much important. They have many, fans in the United States, that many people in Latin America don't care about these sort of games. They want to see what is the outcome for them. That's why I think the Trump administration, the whole concept of this administration, is missing the point in Latin America. They can build friendship with Brazil, with Colombia, with all of these countries in Latin America in a very different way. But it seems that somehow this sort of the legacy of empire is so much influential even on the current policies of the administration, that they don't care about these people in Latin America. You have to communicate with these people. You have to make deals with these people. You're not going to go and force them into something, because you're not, after all. You see what is happening, with the case of Russia, China, and these sort of changes that are happening. These are colossal changes, and everybody's witnessing that. And you have to understand, if you want to have a better future, you have to make new friendship, new partnership, not new enemies. And is that considered, is sort of concept considered in the current administration? I don't see that. This is the problem.
I don't know, Nima, but I will say this. It's not, I think it's up to the people, ultimately, the American people and the people in countries like Brazil and Venezuela and so forth. And you see, what we're seeing now in Venezuela is a very, very strong, passionate reaction against the American incursion and abduction of Nicolas Maduro. And so, if millions of people spill out into the street and say, no, we will not have this, then people in the United States have to take notice and say, well, I guess it's going to be very difficult for us to change the hearts and minds the way we started, thinking that we'll just brutalize them into submission. Then you have to make nice with them because they're armed, because there's between 1.5 and 3 millions of these colectivos, which are dispersed. Most of them are rural. They know their jungles, while you can't bring enough troops to Venezuela to fight them by force. So either you're going to have to say, okay, we can't take their oil, we can't invest tens of billions of dollars here to to extract their resources. Maybe we have to make a good deal with them. So that's one thing. And then we've also seen in the United States itself many protests on the streets by American people who are saying, we didn't vote for this, we're dead against this. And people in the Trump administration are going to have to take notice of that too, because you can't beat everybody into submission and call them, I don't know, anti-Semites and whatever you might want to call them. You're going to have to take them into consideration. And so I think that I think that this is becoming quite apparent because, in the age before the internet, before YouTube, before social media, we kind of had to believe what we heard on the radio, or saw on TV, and read in the newspapers, and we didn't suspect how far they went to lie to us. We didn't suspect that they built whole studios with special effects equipment to show us imagery that is completely false, but to show us, oh, look, the Germans are bayoneting babies in Belgium, right? So this doesn't work anymore. And the extent to which it doesn't work anymore is even discernible in what they're talking about. All of these people like Ursula von der Leyen and Kaya Kallas and Klaus Schwab, and they're having tantrums over misinformation and disinformation. Klaus Schwab just, I think this week, published an article in the Time magazine about basically lamenting that they lost control. They have no control. They are unable to implement policies and see them through because, they say that people people don't believe them, that the trust is broken, and that the people can't discern the truth. It's not that. Trust in your structures is broken, and people know that you're not telling them the truth. And instead, people are gravitating to other sources, like among other places, your podcast, to try to hear things, explanations, and information that they might say, like, this sounds a bit more credible, more convincing than what they're telling me on CNN. So I think that in the end, the full effect of this is that people are no longer falling into line with the official narrative. So when they tell them, the Russians are coming, I guess you're going to have to sacrifice your children, people don't say like, yes, it's my patriotic duty to sacrifice my children. They say like, no, we don't agree. You can't have my children. I will not go to war for you, and neither will they. And so now they see that they can't get the population to vaccinate fully. They can't get us to buy into semi-annual or quarterly boosters. Nobody believes the climate story anymore. Nobody believes in going to war against Russia anymore, and so on and so forth. This public support for Israel has cratered irreversibly. It's not coming back. And so what does this mean? It means that they will have to change course because the public pressure is doing that. And so I think that Trump administration is also going to have to take public pressure into account in, simply having to make nice with the people and respond to their aspirations and demands. And so in the final analysis, it's not even so relevant who Trump is, whether he's really a madman, whether he's compromised, whether he's some kind of a clever gangster guy who's playing 5D chess. It doesn't matter. In the end, people will have to take popular demands into account and drive policy in the direction that people want.
Alex, I think many of our audience are so much suspicious about Donald Trump because you see who's close to Donald Trump right now. Lindsey Graham. Every time he's talking, Lindsey Graham is there. I don't understand why is he there and what is the benefit of Lindsey Graham being part of the administration. And he's pushing for more sanctions on Russia right now. And Donald Trump says, go ahead and do it. And let me play a clip of Tucker Carlson explaining what's going on in the United States and how crucial is the situation between the United States and Russia. Here is what they said.
The signs suggest that we're going to have a big war soon. The president announced that he is hiking the Pentagon budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. Just announced that. That's the kind of budget that a country that anticipates a global or regional war has for its military. Obviously, we're moving in that direction toward a world war. Sorry. So, how do you position yourself for that? Well, you look at a map and you ask, what areas do I want to control? Where are the trade routes? Who's got the resources? And if you were to do that, you would arrive at the most obvious conclusion of all, which is the United States has to have a relationship with Russia in order to survive anything like that.
And, but that's not the case in the United States. Those people, even within the Trump administration, we cannot ignore that. And I would assume the first thing that this administration should have done was the conflict in Ukraine. And looking at what has happened since Donald Trump took power, the attack on nuclear bombers, then the attack that Russian government says the attack was on Putin residence in Russia. So if somebody is doing that, you have to recognize that. You have to see the threat coming out of these sort of movements, because somehow the Russian patients, Alex, you remember before February 2022, Russia did everything to negotiate with the West, with the United States and Europeans. They have lost their patience. Then they went into Ukraine to fight with Ukrainians and NATO altogether. And it seems that this sort of escalation is heading toward the same sort of outcome. If we see something breaking out between the Russian forces and American forces, or maybe the British forces, because this will be a huge chaos that would get out of the hand to manage that, to control that.
Yeah, but I would be very careful about this, because if Trump is increasing military budget from 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion, well, we'll have to look at what is he going to be spending it on. Because I know that, for example, the Department of Defense is investing large amounts of money. I think tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions into refineries for rare earth metals, among other things. Uh, America has lost competitiveness, and it has lost competitiveness to countries like Russia and China, right? And Russia and China have a state capitalist model because the state says, okay, we're going to be developing our economy in this direction. And then they, fund universities and research organizations, and they provide credit for these types of developments. And the state is kind of the captain on the big ship, and then downstream from the state there's entrepreneurs, and when you get to the bottom of the hierarchy you have actual free market capitalism where private companies do the work, but it's not random, it's directed by the state. So state is ultimately the one that's allocating colossal amounts of capital into AI, nuclear energy, solar energy, car manufacturing, and on and on and on, right, in China. Whereas in the United States, you have everything is private because that's ideologically the only way to go in the Western free market capitalism, and as a result, nothing, all the wealth of a society kind of ends up percolating into Wall Street banks, and industries gutted, and competitiveness is being lost year after year after year. And so, if you want to reverse that, you're going to have to go back to state capitalism. And from the ideological point of view, that's almost a no-go. It's unsellable in the United States. But if you package it as national security, patriotism, U.S. Army, rah, 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 then people say like, okay, we have to be strong, we have to be powerful, and we have the greatest military in the world, and all these things. But you have to look into all the line items to see what this is being allocated to. The United States going to war against Russia makes no sense whatsoever. It would be completely suicidal. And for what? Are you going to conquer Russia and own it? And if you did, then what? You would have like 140, 150 million Russians who don't want you there. Napoleon tried, Hitler tried. Why? How dumb would you have to be to make this your policy? And then let's not forget, um, what was it? 3 weeks ago, Dmitry, no, Kirill, help me.
Kirill Dmitriev.
Kirill Dmitriev, yeah. Kirill Dmitriev was in Florida, and they were all practically high fiving, and there's not going to be any war. We're in agreement on all kinds of things. And now, all of a sudden, Trump is trying to kill Putin and take Russian and okay, sanctions. Russians don't care. Russians literally don't care. Sanction away. It doesn't hurt us. Eventually, all the sanctions against Russia are going to be dropped. So, until a certain point, all of these little darts thrown in their directions don't matter. And then, like the last thing, why I wish to be very careful, because before I erupt into righteous outrage against Trump, is for the following reason. If he is true to his intent, to his stated intent to attack these money lending oligarchies on Wall Street and in the city of London, he has to hide his hand. He can't do it overtly. He can't put them on alert. And so I would say, imagine that you lived in a town that was brutalized by some kind of a mob, right? They were forcing everybody to pay protection money. They were, I don't know, brutalizing their children, their women, and so forth. And this mob is far too powerful for anybody in the town to take them down. And then somebody said, okay, we have to take them down, but before we can take them down, we have to get inside of their organization, right? This is what undercover cops do. And an undercover cop has to get inside of the organization to learn their weaknesses, to learn who the key nodes are to take down, who the most powerful players are, and so forth. And to do that, you have to get their confidence. And so at a given moment in time, your insider cop is going to look dirty as sin to everybody observing from the outside. But if you take him out, you've just cemented your slavery to this mob, right? He's your only hope of salvation. And so I would say, until you're sure that Trump is your enemy, my position is I'm agnostic. I believe in the people, the American people, the Russian people, Venezuelan people, and so forth. I think people always collectively push in the right direction. When it comes to politicians, it's very hard to be sure. It took me a long time to get around to figuring out that Putin is a positive player in world affairs. And for Trump, I have to say I'm agnostic, because I don't know, because he is making sure that nobody knows. And so one day, but then like he reduces the vaccine schedule in the United States from 70 some. I think they reduced it by 55 vaccines. Well, I think that's great. And now he's going to Davos, where he's going to say that we're going to ban corporations owning single family homes. Well, that's a good thing, right? Because he said people live in homes, not corporations. So there's a lot of things that he is doing that give me hope that he is doing something right and positive for the American people. And so it's very hard for me to then think like, oh yeah, and then he's going to start World War III against Russia, try to assassinate Putin, and regime change Iran, and all of these insane things that they are not even capable of doing, let alone why would you do that? So before you hang the undercover cop, at least you should be extra doubly sure that he's a dirty player rather than maybe your potential salvation.
There is a concept, Alex, that may say Iran and Russia, even China, should be less scared of the United States than the countries within NATO. With the move on Greenland, with the move on Canada, somehow the British government is so scared. They don't talk about it, but you feel that they are so scared of what would happen to Canada in a long run, or what would come to Greenland. How do you see the internal policy of NATO? How do you see the communication among the NATO countries, the United States with Europeans when it comes to Greenland? And how do you see NATO going on as time goes by?
I think it's all breaking apart, Nima, and I think that we just had the Three Stooges in Paris sign some kind of a commitment to Ukraine. It's
That's so strange. That's so strange.
it looks like people propping up a corpse. Like they take a corpse and they prop him up on some sticks to make everybody believe that the corpse is still alive and they can fight. But I think it's lost and it's hopeless. And now everybody's talking of like, oh well, if Trump takes Greenland, then that's going to be the end of NATO. Trump is taking Greenland. He's not joking about that, and I think he's coming for Canada as well. And so, again, you're going to have some people who say like, well, he's tearing up the system of international law, the rules based order, blah blah blah. Well, I the current rules based order is so profoundly rotten to the core that it needs to be taken down. It really needs to be taken down. It has to be thoroughly reformed. And if Trump's doing that, then maybe it's a step in the right direction. If he's doing it in cooperation with the Russians and the Chinese, then I'm doubly confident that it is a step in the right direction. Because you have to start learning about the nature of money and credit. You have to start learning about the nature of fiscal offshore centers. You have to learn about the meaning of money laundering, which is not for no reason called the mother of all crimes, because it makes all other crimes possible, because it makes them pay. If crime doesn't pay, a lot of it would disappear. But it's the money laundering banks that make sure that it pays, and it's a huge source of funds for them. And then, you know, I think we have to learn a lot more about global organizations that enjoy absolute legal immunity across the world. And a lot of them are banks, and a lot of them are organizations that have to do with regulation of agriculture, and a lot of them are organizations that have to do with regulation of health, public health, and things like vaccinations and stuff. And they are literally untouchable. That is also part of the international law. And if you can't touch the criminals, well, then you're at their mercy. And a very concrete case is what we started with Canada, because in Canada they have this thing called the Stitchcomb rule, which says that if you investigate a drug runner in Canada, the authorities have to inform them that they're being investigated, that they're the target of the investigation, supposedly for reasons of fairness and human rights and blah blah blah. But that means that even though Canada is a massive component of the drug and people and weapons smuggling into the United States, nobody in Canada got charged, even though they busted TD Bank for laundering, even though they busted a super lab in British Columbia, nobody went to prison. And the Canadian authorities are systematically stonewalling American attempts to investigate and to take down these networks, which means that if you go by legal means, you're simply at the mercy of these criminal gangs. And just to understand how bad this is, Nima, this has very many characteristics in common with opium wars. And opium wars destroyed China from 1830s on, and then subjected China to a century of humiliation. China was the leading global economic superpower at that time, a 6,000-year civilization that was brought down by opium wars, which were conducted by the British Empire. And today, you have in the United States, from the north and from the south, they're practically surrounded by these gangs that are flooding millions of illegal migrants into the United States, and that are flooding oceans of methamphetamines and fentanyl and pot and all kinds of drugs from labs in Canada. So it and if you look at what the city streets in the United States look like, it doesn't take a genius to realize that the United States is at the receiving end of the 21st century opium war, and that their hands, like they're in the legal sense, American authorities' hands are tied. They are not able to defend themselves against this. So we have to take all this into consideration before we hang the undercover cop who might be, running some kind of a scheme to take these organizations down.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always. Enjoying really what the discussion was so much productive in my opinion.
Well, let's find out, Nima. Again, I'm agnostic. I think only time will tell whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong. Pay attention to the British podcasts, to British interviews, to British media. Pay attention to European officials. Pay attention to what the Russians and the Chinese say, because if Trump went rogue, it'll register, and then people in London and in Paris and in Brussels, they're going to be very happy with Trump. I think a lot of time will pass before we really know for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Great pleasure, Alex, as always.
Greetings to everyone, and thank you for having me, Nima.
See you soon, Alex. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.